Perfect. And we're on.
Okay.
All right. So I'm going to say a couple of quick words. Emilia Davis is the one who kind of approached us to make this connection with Nino Ricci because of this project that she's working on with her group of fellow students. So Emilia, what I will do then, since you're here, I will pass the baton to you so that you can introduce everyone else and then talk a little bit about what it is that you're doing. I was able to send Nino the questions that you had, so he has them, and you guys can start chatting. So
Okay.
off to you.
First of all, it's such an honor and a pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much for doing this. Yeah, my name is Emilia Davis. Okay, I guess I'll ask the first question. So, what inspired you to write this book? And when you were planning the novel, what themes did you want to explore?
Now, first, I need to say that I wrote this book 35, 40 years ago. So there are some things I might not remember. But part of what inspired this book for me was that I had been writing a lot of stories in which the characters didn't really come out of a clear cultural background. This was a time when to be ethnic meant that you were sort of outside the mainstream, and already to be Canadian meant to be outside the mainstream in a sense. Like when you went into a bookstore in those days, there was literature and then there was Canadian, and it was sort of put in a little ghetto. And then if within that you were also ethnic, that was like another ghetto where you just didn't really exist. And so there was, a certain resistance to me, to writing out of my Italian background because of that. Because, I didn't want to just write to Italians. I wanted to write to everybody. But at a certain point, I realized, when I moved from writing stories to writing a novel, I realized, I'm going to need a deeper background to draw from. And so, I have to go to what I know. And this was what I knew. I knew my own background. I think, part of the impulse I had in setting the book in Italy was that it was a kind of way of getting around the idea of ethnicity. Because my characters in Italy, they don't think of themselves as ethnic. They're not immigrants. They're not outside their culture. They're in their culture. So in a way, I could deal with, my own roots and with my own experience of Italianness, but at the same time, I could deal with larger, anything I wanted to deal with. And, there's a lot of things that come into the book. There's the issue of religion is big, and what is moral, and what kinds of stories we tell ourselves through things like religion, but also through superstition and other sources of story. How does our imagination get formed? Issues of feminism and the treatment of women and the role of women certainly come up through the mother, and these were all things I was thinking about at the time. I was doing a master's degree in literature, and there were issues that were coming up for me, and also, I guess, trying to think of the immigrant experience in a way that wasn't marginalizing, because it seemed to me that the immigrant experience was really a central experience, not only in our own time, but throughout history. Throughout history, there has been this impulse of people to move from one place to another, to try and find almost a kind of promised land. It's almost really the story of the Bible, which is, we had a paradise, we lost it, and we're trying to get back to it somehow. There's a Canadian critic, Northrop Frye, who talks about what he calls the monomyth, which is, that big story of losing paradise and trying to get it back. And at a certain point, before I wrote this novel, I had interviewed a lot of immigrants, a lot of Italian immigrants in my hometown, and I was surprised at how many times that story pattern came up, that they all thought of, America as this promised land they were going to, where, the streets are paved with gold, everything would be easy, their lives would be better. Though, another side of that I saw is that, once they got to Canada, and realized it wasn't part of America. But, you know, and they made their way here. It was not nearly as easy as they thought it would be, but eventually they made their way. But then, in a way, the old country became a kind of lost paradise for them. Even though they'd been poor there and life had been hard, there was still a part of them that had only ever really been at home there. And they could never get back there, because even when they, you know, traveled back there after 15 years or whatever, they didn't fit in anymore, because that world had progressed and evolved, and people didn't speak the dialect anymore, or the dialect that they spoke was mixed up with English, and so they didn't feel quite at home there. So there was always that sense also of a lost wholeness in them as immigrants that they can never get back to. So I just wanted to find a way to tell that bigger story and fit it in really to a kind of mythic pattern of human storytelling that we see, you know, going right back to Homer and the Odyssey. You know, what's the Odyssey about? It's about a guy who's left home and wants to get back there, wants to find his wholeness again. So yeah, so all that was in my head when I started writing the book. Did that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
I may have lost track of what the question was, but
Emilia, you know what I was curious about, if I may, is what made you guys choose this novel to write about? What was it that, and what impressions did you have as you were reading it and exploring it? And this is a question for any of you, actually, so please feel free to jump in.
Well, I chose this novel because I'm Italian, and I'm always kind of interested in like reading more about the cultural. There were a lot of cultural aspects in this book, which I found really interesting. So, and I like this when I read the back with the snake and the superstition. I just found that really interesting. So, yeah.
mm-hmm.
Anyone else?
Hello, I'm Darshan. I probably said that on the screen, but I'm going to say it anyways. So touching upon your question, so I'm in high school right now, and I chose this book to read. So I did Google it, and it had like suspension and superstitions, which motivated me to choose this book out of the other ones. But do you think it is important for high school students to read this book?
It's hard for me to say, because, you know, I can't be objective about my own work. You know, I think one thing I want to say, and, you know, Happy and I were talking about this earlier, is that I think it's important for high school students to read Canadian books. And I don't know how much that happens, because those are books that are going to speak about their own experience. And much of that experience for many Canadians is an immigrant experience. So anything that can, you know, address that. You know, this book is about an Italian immigrant experience, but I had so many people from other cultures recognize themselves in this book, and in this kind of village life, and in this, you know, this dichotomy between religion and superstition, and in the kind of oppressive culture that village culture can be, but also, you know, the positive sides of it, and the sense of community and so on. So I think it's important for, you know, students in high school to see that there's literature out there that reflects their experience and their parents' experience, and that speaks to them about that. So, you know, I would certainly think this book would have that element for many Canadians, not only of Italian background, but anyone who's come of an immigrant background.
That's wonderful, because I'm an immigrant myself, and I could kind of touch up on like the scenarios of, like, even though I did move here like about 8-9 years ago, there is still part of me that is still left in India, and like the life I live there. So it's pretty relatable. So just to make sure, you're saying that the takeaway for the readers is to kind of expand and expose themselves for like the cultural differences and like what people go through during and after immigration.
Yes, I guess that I mean, that was part of. This is the first volume of 3 books, so a lot of the immigration themes will come out in the second and third novels in the series. Here we just see, I guess, people's expectations and the kind of mythology that develops around immigration and the kinds of hopes that people have for it, and also the disruptive force of it for these towns and villages in the old countries that people come from. My mother's village had a population of about 1,000 at the time of the Second World War, and about half those people moved to our town in Canada, Leamington, and others moved elsewhere. And now in that village, there's about 30 people left. So those villages and that whole culture really has disappeared. A kind of a subsistence level peasant culture that existed, up to the Second World War and beyond, has vanished entirely. And many of those towns are depopulated, and there's, because there's nothing to keep people there. So it's also, so part of, I guess, what I was doing with the novel was just trying to recapture a world that I could see was disappearing from the face of the earth, and see, what was interesting in that world, what was useful, what was to be retained, but also, what was negative and what needed to be escaped and got beyond. And as you say, I think there's, a lot of immigrants come from that kind of background, a more peasant village background, and then are placed in a very different kind of context when they arrive in their new country. So.
Awesome, thank you for answering.
So who wants to go next? There were a few questions.
I'll go next.
Okay.
My name is Matthew. So what is it exactly that made you choose to write the book from the perspective of such a young boy? And did you have any challenges writing this book from this perspective?
I did. I wasn't sure whether I would remember what it was like to be a 7-year-old. But it, with subsequent drafts, it came back to me. It seemed to me that by choosing the child's perspective, it was a way of, it goes back to, I was talking about sort of mythic structures of story, and many stories are about the loss of innocence and the fall into experience. Again, going back to the story of Genesis, that's what happens to Adam and Eve. They're innocent, and then they eat the apple, and they're not innocent anymore, and they're kicked out. And that age, I think for many of us, certainly for me, was the age at which I felt that movement begin from innocence to experience. So there's a point at which, you're full of wonder, and you sort of believe a lot of things about the world, and you place adults on a pedestal, and then you start to discover the dark underside beneath the reality that you thought was kind of idyllic and safe and good. You start noticing all these fault lines in that, and the scales fall from your eyes. And I can remember clearly in my own childhood going through that phase. And that's the phase at which we, by adolescence, we're not always that fond of our parents anymore, because at a certain point they were our heroes. They could do no wrong, and then suddenly we discover, well, they're not as perfect as we thought they were, and in some ways they stand for things that we don't want to stand for. So that was partly the reason I chose that perspective, because it's very much what happens to Vittorio. He's in what feels like this idyllic world. He's got his mother to himself. There's no father to compete with, in the sort of Freudian dichotomy. His grandfather's this respected figure in the town, and then everything falls apart. And he suddenly, has to come to terms with a very different sense of reality than he's been living with until then. And in his own case, it's because there are external circumstances that force it. But it's also, partly just that his understanding increases, and he begins to realize the fantasies of his earlier life were not sustainable. And there's I think there's a great sadness in that transition, because we lose a sense of wonder that's so it's so embracing when we're young. You see it in small children. Everything is new, everything is wonderful, everything is possible. And there's so much in life that just beats that out of us over those years as we grow up, in even in the school system, in the religion. This priest who comes in and is forcing this catechism on the kids. To Vittorio, it's at least the teacher tells him these wonderful stories of saints. The wonder is still there, but then there's this other side of religion that's all about punishment and sin, and you're doing things wrong. And so it's partly that we inevitably go through that movement from innocence to experience, but it's also that the world tries to beat it out of us and make us fit its own shape and conform to what it wants us to be. And a lot in this novel is about that force of conformity. The mother is someone who refuses to conform, and she's punished for it. I mean, that's really her crime. That if she'd had this affair and just admitted it and was repentant, then people would say, okay, we'll bring you back, we'll find a place for you. But because she is defiant, that's what people can't accept. And it's interesting when you look at the stories of the saints that the teacher reads to Vittorio. The saints are those people. They're the people who defy the society in which they live and are punished for it. The Christians who defy the Roman gods and say, no, I believe in this thing. And what happens? The same thing that happens to Christina, the Santa Cristina. She goes through all these chastisements. She's thrown in a pit of snakes. She's had her breast cut off. She's thrown into the sea because she refuses to conform to what the society says she has to do. So in some ways, even though Christina looks like the sinner from the perspective of the Christian orthodoxies, in another way, she acts like the saints. She believes something and she holds to those beliefs despite the conforming pressure of the society around her. So, yeah, I mean, you asked about the 7-year-old. So it's sort of an offshoot of that theme of moving from innocence to experience, and of the kind of conformity that starts to get enforced. It also comes out in the story of the mother as someone who refuses really to give up her own view of things and her own different way of seeing the world.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
That's great. How about you, Aili? Did you have any questions?
Yeah. So I'm Aili. And so we noticed how you included both superstitions and religion in the novel. It seems kind of contradictory at first. So how do you view the roles of both of those within the community?
Yeah. Well, in one way, you could just see it as people hedging their bets. If this system doesn't work, I've got this other one to rely on. I think it was true in a lot of these communities that these belief systems did exist, side by each. Even when I went back in the 90s to my mother's village, and I did a little talk there where I talked about superstition. And afterwards, someone came up to me and he says, yeah, and it's still going on now. And he took me to his house and he showed me in the back room where he had all these effigies and dolls and implements where he practiced his witchcraft. So he had this whole elaborate system of what we call superstition that he was still actively practicing, and I was still hearing stories from people of this sort of thing going on. And I think, I think it was always true in peasant culture, certainly in Italian peasant cultures, that you didn't entirely trust the church, because what you saw the church was not that positive. What you usually saw was excess. You saw priests who sort of lived off the fat of the land and didn't work, and skimmed the offertory for their own benefits. If you went to Rome, you saw a fair amount of excess and corruption, and through the history of the church, right up until the present day. I mean, we still hear all the stories of what priests, not all priests, but some have done, and what the church has covered up. And that's been an issue. That's what gave rise to Protestantism, was people looking around and saying, well, why is that priest, he's got like 3 wives and 15 children that he's supporting. It was not that uncommon for priests to behave badly, and in Italy there was a strong tradition of anti-clericalism, of not trusting the priests or the institution of the church, even while believing in the central tenets of Christianity. In our dialect, the word for person is Christiane, which means Christian. So if you're not a Christian, you're not a person. So I mean, there's a fundamental belief in that, and yet you want other possibilities, and you want to be able to protect yourself also from people who use those other powers, like the evil eye. So you sometimes need to access those belief systems as well. And even within Catholicism, the heavy emphasis on saints and miracles, there's a kind of superstition is not the right word, but there's a level of animism in that feels very pre-Christian almost. That and almost every village will have its stories of its own saint who did X and Y and did little miracles, and it's hard to distinguish what's superstition in that and what is religious faith or Christian faith, because a lot of these even saint stories are not ones that the church would technically support. They have their own sort of register of official stories, but people then sort of supplement that with a lot of secondary storytelling that has the same kind of source, really, as a lot of the superstition does.
Thank
Does
you.
that answer the question, right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So how do we feel? You guys were able to get a better perspective?
Yes.
Is everything clear? Do you have any follow-up questions?
We just had one quick bonus question. Do you think our English teacher, Miss Dashu, should give us 100% on our project?
Yes, definitely. I support that position. I can put it in writing if you need me to.
For choosing a Canadian novel and for choosing Lives of the Saints, guys.
Was
it all of you who chose this book? Is it an independent choice that you all came to?
Yeah. So I think that alone shows great insight and perception. So just based on that, I'm going to give
Definitely.
Yeah.
All right. Congratulations, you guys.
Yeah. Thanks. Those were great questions. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And all the best on your project. Hope it goes well.
Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, keep us posted. Send me a note. I'll definitely share it.
Okay.
And if it's okay with you, then I'll load up this video and then I'll send you the link so you guys can have it. You can share it with your class or with your teacher or whatever, as long as it's yeah. Okay. Wonderful.
Great.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you,
Thank you,
Nino.
guys.
Thank you, Emilia,
Thank you
Aili,
so much.
Darshan, and Matthew.
Thank you.
you.
Thanks for spending
Thank
time with
you.
us and answering our questions.
It was a pleasure.
Take care, everyone.
Okay.